Before I speak, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Blessed Lord our God, our Father in heaven, our King, our Creator, our Protector, and our Shield. Lord, we thank you for these texts you have left behind that give us insight into your heart, and more importantly for us, give us insight into our own heart so that we might live towards you. Oh, blessed Lord, I pray you'll give me words to speak this day. Give us all ears to hear, minds to understand, hands to do, feet to walk in your ways, and above all, Lord, may we be transformed by our encounter with your truth. And I pray this all b'Shem Yeshua. Amen. So we are continuing in my open-ended series on Galatians. This is part 3. And I have subtitled this one, Paul's Calling, Israel and the Nations. And as I spoke about before, we're trying to approach Paul perhaps differently than what might be considered the dominant paradigm of Paul that has been around for 1,700 years. And one of the 1,700-year-old major theological streams that we are swimming up against can be stated in the following way. Paul was a strict Pharisaic Jew before the event on the road to Damascus and a devout Christian after that. The position declares that the encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus was a literal conversion from Judaism to Christianity. It is one of the foundation stones of this mainstream systematic theology that purports this. The system requires that Paul had a complete switch from one religion to another. Paul, from that moment, rejected a religion based on the law and embraced a religion based on grace. But let's remember that Paul did not set out to write a systematic theology in his letters. He wrote letters to congregations that he had planted, as well as those he did not plant, but visited. In those letters, he addressed issues that real people in real congregations were facing, and he provided advice and direction. The conversion approach cites as evidence the passages in Paul's letters which seem to denigrate the role of the law or the Torah. The problem with this position we've already touched on in a previous sermon. There is ample evidence of Paul's continued personal pursuit of Torah observance after his encounter on the road to Damascus. And this includes halakhic traditions that Paul made, which seem like that were developed through the oral Torah of the time. Moreover, for every statement that Paul made, which seems like a condemnation of the Torah, there is equally one that seems to express exuberant praise for it. Let me give you a short list of these apparent contradictions with respect to the Torah that can be found in the Pauline epistles. For the sake of time, I'll probably paraphrase what is said, but I'll give you the citations. Galatians 2:15 through 16, in that it says, "No one will be justified by works of the law." Contrast that with Romans chapter 2, verse 13. "It is not the hearers of the law who are righteous, but the doers of the law that will be justified." Galatians chapter 3, verse 10. "All who rely on works of the law are under a curse," as opposed to Romans 7:12. "The law is holy and the commandment holy and just and good." Romans 2:27. "Those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you that have the written code and circumcision but break the law." Contrast with Romans 3:1 through 2. "What is the value of circumcision? Much in every way." And it ends up saying Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Romans 4, chapter 14, or verses 14 through 15. "If it is The adherents of the law who are told who are to be heirs, faith is null and the promise void. Contrast that with what we're going to see here in Galatians. Is the law opposed to the promise of God? Certainly not. So you can see these are paired, and there's many more examples. Paul dealing with specific issues, when you take them as a whole, it appears that he contradicts himself. But he doesn't. So as an overall picture of Paul, it seems to me that the idea of Damascus as a conversion to another religion is not supported by Scripture. The apparent contradictions must be looked on differently. It makes the most sense if one can seize Paul's positions from within the broad range of the Judaisms of his time. Instead of a condemnation of Judaism, Paul takes up, in essence, polemical discourses against specific positions within Judaism that he sees as errors. I should probably restate that. Instead of a condemnation of Judaism, Paul takes up polemical discourses against specific positions within Judaism that he sees as errors. Polemical, in case you're not familiar with that, it's a controversial argument taking a stand on a certain position. It is not to be taken, his letters are not to be taken as a condemnation from the outside of Judaism, the religion of his fathers, rather a clarification from within. Yet, we cannot deny that the Damascus encounter most certainly did happen, and Paul was indeed transformed by that encounter with the risen Yeshua. Perhaps if we can understand what he saw as his transformation, then we can better understand how his letters applied at the time and what we might gain from them today. So once again, let's see what Paul himself said about this defining moment. Paul's calling. Can we look on it as a conversion, or can we look on it as a prophetic calling? That's what I will suggest. Let's go ahead and open up your Bibles. Go to Galatians, and I'm going to get past the first word. We'll probably jump around here and there to make this point. So verse 1, Paul, an emissary, sent not from men or by men, but by Yeshua the Messiah and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. In this introduction to this letter, Paul immediately announces that his authority for issuing the contents that will follow comes from the Son and the Father. He was sent by Adonai and Yeshua as the Hebrew word is shaliach, their emissary, their sent one, which is most often translated as apostle. This statement brings up 2 points. One, he is speaking under God's authority, and two, he is not representing merely a sect of Judaism, as presumably were the people who were troubling the Galatians. He's putting himself at odds, and he's expressing why he has authority to address this. So now move down to verses 15 through 16, and we'll get a little more insight. But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so I would proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with any human. This is very specific language that he's chosen here. And it gives us a strong indication as to how Paul viewed his encounter on the road to Damascus. What we need to do is compare this language to the language used by Jeremiah the prophet. If you want to take a moment to get to Jeremiah chapter 1. We're going to go to verses 4 and 5. This is Jeremiah the prophet speaking. The Lord gave me this message. I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as my prophet to the nations. That word nations is goyim, translated in the New Testament as Gentiles. So that you could very easily put that in as prophet to the Gentiles. Paul is very intentionally patterning his declaration directly after the prophet Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. But it is noteworthy that Paul does not call himself a prophet. Rather, he describes his calling as one to proclaim. That's what he said. We'll get back to that in a moment. But let's look for more parallels within Jeremiah. Paul's message to the Gentiles will be Besora, will be good news, good tidings. But if you've read Jeremiah, who is touted as the prophet to the nations, you will see that Jeremiah in general brings a message to the Gentile nations that was primary warning and pending doom. The last several chapters of the book of Jeremiah are all pointed at the surrounding nations. But scattered within Jeremiah's message are positive predictions for the nations. 2 points here are interesting for us to draw parallels to Paul. Turn to Jeremiah chapter 4. We're going to do the first couple verses. If you will return, O Israel, return to me, declares Adonai. If you will put your detestable things out of my sight, then you will not waver. I will swear, says Adonai, as Adonai lives, in truth, in justice, and in righteousness. The nations will bless themselves in him, and in him they will glory. These words of Jeremiah chapter 4 make a clear link between the obedience of Israel to God's calling and covenant and the future of the nations through one referred to only as him, which we can see obviously is Messiah. This statement references the Abrahamic covenant and the promise of the blessing of the nations, which specifically connects it to Israel's returning to God. Remember, he said, and all the nations will bless themselves through you. Jeremiah is echoing that here. The fate of the nations is connected to the restoration of Israel and the Jewish Messiah's coming. So now let's take a look at chapter 9. Starting at verse 24. Days are coming, declares Adonai, when I will punish all who are circumcised and yet uncircumcised. Egypt, Judah, Edom, and Ammon's children, and Moab, and all that have cut the corners of their hair, that dwell in the wilderness. For all the nations are uncircumcised, but all the house of Israel are uncircumcised of the heart. A day is coming. That is a prophetic warning of the end times, the coming of the Messiah. Clearly predicts a specific time in the future when God will judge both the nations and Israel together. It is here that Jeremiah makes a point of heart circumcision. Judgment will come to both the circumcised and the uncircumcised. And he makes an equivalency between uncircumcised Jewish hearts and the physically uncircumcised goyim, or nations. It is no coincidence that Paul parallels Jeremiah's calling and also makes use of the very same themes throughout his letters. Paul's teaching that frequently makes reference to circumcision and the uncircumcision have been ensconced in the words of Jeremiah for 600 years before Paul was ever called. These were words that Shaul, the rabbi, studied intensely. His reference point is an understanding of this. Please note that the promise of judgment for both circumcised Israel and uncircumcised nations is clear. And while not on the surface of the words, the implication under the words is that salvation for both is also there. If both parties can have a circumcised heart, then neither will be subject to catastrophic judgment. Circumcision of the heart is the most important unifying ideal among Israel and the nations, according to Jeremiah. Let's look a little further. You can go back to Galatians. This time, here we go. Let's look at Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Taiz with me. Because of a revelation, I went up and presented to them the good news that I proclaimed among the Gentiles. But I did so privately to those who seemed to be influential, to make sure I would not run or had not run in vain. What he said was he went up because of a revelation. Again, that a revelation is something that happens to prophets. That's a pattern consistent with prophets. He received a revelation from God concerning his role to reach out to the Gentiles. He presented this to those that he had never met, who were the main leading apostles who had actually followed Yeshua in his earthly ministry. And again, he says, the good news that I proclaim among the Gentiles, present tense, active voice, something he's doing now. Proclaiming. There's an example. That's proclaiming. Remember, that's what he said. Here's an example of the kind of proclaiming that Jewish prophets had predicted. This one is in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7. You're going to be flipping all over and getting paper cuts today. Isaiah 52. Verse 7. It reads this way. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who, and this translation says, announces shalom, proclaims shalom, who brings good news of happiness, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. How lovely are the feet on the mountain of the one who brings Besorah, the good news, who proclaims Mashmiach. Mashmiach. We say that in a song up here. Mashmiach shalom. Proclaiming shalom. Bringing Besorah of good tidings. Proclaiming Mashmiach, Yeshua. Proclaiming salvation. Who says to Zion, your God reigns. Isaiah praises someone other than himself for doing this. Isaiah isn't saying, I'm going to come in the future and do this. He's looking at someone else who has lovely feet. Isaiah is looking to the future and sees this person. Isaiah sees a time when someone other than himself will mashmiach, proclaim the Besorah of Yeshua, the good news of salvation. And then a couple verses later, in verse 10, you can see how this now expands to the nations. 52 verse 10, Adonai has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the Gentiles, all the nations. All the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God, that is Yeshua Eloheinu. That kind of proclamation. That's the proclamation that Paul sees himself as bringing. By not calling himself a prophet, yet tying into the message of Jeremiah, one is drawn to the conclusion that Paul has realized that in essence, the salvation clock has sounded an alarm. The time has come. And it's a late hour. And that he is then doing what the prophets anticipated would happening. He would proclaim. He would bring a proclamation to the nations to reveal Yeshua Adonenu, the Yeshua, the salvation of our God. Let's go back to Galatians 2:6 through 10. And remember, what we're looking at is, how did Paul see what happened on the road to Damascus? But from those who seemed to be influential, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those influential ones added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the good news for the uncircumcised, just as Peter was for the circumcised. For the same God who was at work in Peter as an emissary to the Jews was also at work in me as an emissary to the Gentiles. Realizing the favor that had been given to me, Jacob and Peter and John, who are the recognized pillars, shook hands in partnership with Barnabas and me, so that we would go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. They asked only that we remember the poor, something I also was eager to do. Paul has presented his experience and divine commission as a shaliach to the Gentiles, to the pillars of the community, to those who had actually walked with Yeshua, the believing Jews of the ecclesia of the circumcision. And it is agreed that the twofold message of the good news has now been initiated. The salvation clock has sounded a second alarm. The first was to announce the good news to the Jews, which Yaakov, Peter, and John answered. And the second was to begin the good news to the Gentiles, which was the job of Paul and his assistant Barnabas. This moment that Paul is describing as already having happened is a critically important moment to understand the implications of. This is the moment when it becomes known that there is to be two distinct identities within the single assembly of those who are saved by the atoning work of Yeshua. There is one ecclesia, one church, one ecclesia with two distinct but unified branches. Often in Pauline letters, there is a reference to the ecclesia of the circumcision and the ecclesia of the uncircumcision. God's intent for his house has been revealed, and it is this meeting between Paul and Yaakov and Peter and John. Paul's calling is equivalent to Yaakov, Peter, and John's. But whereas the latter is responsible for proclaiming the Besorah, the good news, to the Jews, Paul is responsible for proclaiming the Besorah to the Gentiles. One house, two distinct but united identities within it, neither greater than the other. Both enter the house through the same door. It is just that they took a different path to get there. For the circumcision, they needed to recognize the door as leading to the long-promised Messiah, forgiving sin and restoring the covenant. They needed to have faith in those promises. It is faith in the one that fulfills those promises that saves. For the uncircumcision, the door leads actually out of idolatry and into covenant. They too need to recognize the futility of idolatry and what it represents and the separation from the Creator that idolatry caused. And they need to have faith in the one that led them out of idolatry and into this covenant. That's the momentous thing that happened when Paul and John and Peter and Yaakov, known as James, all met. That's what happened, was this whole thing, this whole process that we are an end product of, or at least a late product of, began there. So now let's look what is written about the Damascus encounter itself. And for that, we're going to need to go to the book of Acts again. Let's listen to the details. You'll need to go back to Acts chapter 9. I'll go through this as we go. Starting at verse 3. As he was traveling, approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. See, remember that he's on his way. He's got that letter from the high priest with permission to persecute Hadarech, the way, the followers of Yeshua. He's carrying that with him. And all of a sudden, this blinding light. Falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Shaul, Shaul, why are you persecuting me? So Paul had this letter to go persecute Jews that he felt were errant. He believed they were heading down the wrong path and causing a great deal of trouble. He thought of Netzari Jews as a misguided sect of Judaism that was going to cause trouble and needed to be eradicated. He thought they were just following the memory of a dead Jew. But now he hears this voice, says, why are you persecuting me? So he asks in verse 5, who are you, Lord? Said Shaul. And he gets the answer, I am Yeshua, whom you are persecuting. You see, that letter that was in his pocket was for Jews living in the diaspora and synagogues that followed. But what he's told here is, no, you're not just persecuting them. You're persecuting me, the Messiah of Israel. Shaul thought he was just after that. But Yeshua himself is speaking to them, and that must have told Paul he is most certainly alive. And he is speaking from heaven, accompanied by a blast of blinding light. Listen, that is the light at the first creation. Let there be light. That's what's known in mystical Jewish circles as Ein Sof, this creative light. Now on to verse 6. But get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. He gets his directions. Actually, redirections. Because remember, he was going to Damascus anyway. He had one purpose, to go persecute people, throw them in chains, bring them to jail. Now he was going to Damascus. Instead of under the authority of the chief priest, now he is commanded under the authority of the Messiah himself, Yeshua. You know, it kind of has echoes to me of Balaam. Balaam was going to be hired, and what does he say? Should I go? And God finally relents and says, yeah, go, but you can only do what I want you to do. That puts a parallel between the persecutor Paul and Balaam. He too will go to the same place he originally intended, but now he will serve the one true God. Verses 7 through 9. The men traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Shaul got up from the ground, but opening his eyes, he could see nothing. They led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he could not see, and he did not eat or drink. There are witnesses there to help him, and they're mind-boggled at what happened. He is blind, and he ends up fasting for 3 days because of that. He's in darkness and fasting for 3 days. Does that echo something else? Well, yes. Instead of resembling Balaam now, he resembles another enemy of the Jewish people, Pharaoh. Remember the plague? Thick koshek, thick darkness surrounded the Egyptians. They couldn't get up. It was a forced 3-day fast in Egypt. Paul is going through the same thing. Thick koshek, his eyes literally shielded, surrounded him. He couldn't do anything. He needed to be led around. He couldn't function. God is mandating that he also has a 3-day fast, just like the Egyptians got. Verse 10. Now there was a disciple named Ananias in Damascus. And the Lord said to him, Ananias, he said, here I am, Lord. Ananias, the righteous Jewish follower of Yeshua, answers God with that appropriate response, Hineni, the same one Samuel gave, the same one Moses gave, and others when called, I am totally at your disposal. says Ananias, verses 11 through 14. The Lord said to him, get up and go to the street named Straight, Peshit or Peshat, and ask in the house of Judah for someone from Tarsus named Shaul. For look, he is praying, and in a vision he has seen a man named Ananias coming in and laying his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to our kedoshim, our set-apart ones, our holy ones in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the ruling Kohanim to tie up all who call on your name. Ananias is obedient, but he's not all on board with this. He understands the risk that Paul has posed to Hadarech. Shaul's reputation of persecution has preceded him. Nonetheless, Ananias, having said Hineni, acts Hineni and does what he's told. Verse 15, but the Lord said to him, go, for he is a choice instrument to carry my name before the nations and kings and Bnei Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. I believe that was 16 also. Critical to understanding Paul's encounter. He is a choice instrument to carry my name before who? The Goyim, that is nations or Gentiles, kings, plural, and Bnei Israel. This is Paul's mission, and it identifies his target audience, Gentiles, kings, and since he's going out to the Gentile nations and encountering Jews, that means Paul is the messenger to diaspora Jews. Jews will primarily get their message from Yaakov, Peter, and John back in the Holy Land, but Paul has this to do also. As to Gentiles and their kings, well, this will be Saul's main mission. His great commission, if you will, to teach them that they too have an election into a covenantal relationship with God, accepting the covenantal promises he made, if they will accept it on faith and escape from idolatry. Their approach may be different, these Gentiles coming to faith, but Paul is a choice instrument. That's the way we say the right man for the job. Remember what we learned about him? Hebrew of Hebrews, Torah scholar, Ivy League Torah scholar. And on top of that, what? A Roman citizen. This is why he is called a choice instrument. But here is the echo of the calling of a prophet in that last verse I read, verse 16. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Listen, I've said this before. In a lot of circles, there are people going around saying, I'm a prophet, or I have a prophecy for you or something. No one should desire to be a prophet. Read what happened to them. No one should desire to be a prophet. They all had difficult lives and even more difficult deaths. It is to Shaul's credit that he did not just do what Jonah tried to do, bail out. Shaul is committed. He will do it. It is total dedication, and it is stepping into something that will guarantee his suffering. Read about Paul's life, which we may do more and more. Whipped with lashes, 40-1, stoned and left for dead. He's thrown in prison, beaten. He certainly fulfilled that prophetic announcement about him. Total dedication. Verse 18. Immediately, something like scales fell from Shaul's eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he got up and was immersed. I'll read on the 19. And when he had taken food, he was strengthened, and now for several days he was with the disciples in Damascus. The darkness leaves him. Something like scales falls from his eyes. Just as an aside, remember that Paul himself would then take that personal experience. And when he would talk about the Jewish people who had not accepted Yeshua, how would he speak of it? A partial blindness has come over them. What happened to him? Total blindness. He's granting a lot towards Jews that have not yet come to faith in Yeshua. He's saying a partial blindness. Partial blindness means partial seeing also. So anyway, something like scales fell from his eyes. Unlike Pharaoh, Paul is saved from the error of his ways. Immediately, he goes and gets immersed in a mikvah, which, as I've taught from up here before, this whole idea of immersion in a mikvah in Jewish tradition is the idea of death and rebirth. You go in one man, that man dies in the water and rises up a new life, a reborn life. So this is exactly what has happened with Paul. Rebirth into a new calling. This is the Jewish act of rebirth as a sign of a new direction in life. Verse 20. Immediately he began proclaiming Yeshua in the synagogue, saying, "He is Ben Elohim." This is the beginning of his assigned task. Remember, it said he would speak to the nation and to kings and to Bnei Israel. He's in a synagogue immediately, mashmiach, proclaiming Yeshua is the Son of God. That was the description recorded. Luke wrote Acts. So that is the description recorded by Luke of the encounter in Acts. But how does Paul himself see this encounter? Also in Acts. Turn to 22. Acts chapter 22. Starting at verse 6, he recounts his experience when defending himself against false allegations. Okay, 22:6. I went too far. But it happened that as I was traveling and drawing near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly flashed all around me. I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, "Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me?" I answered, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said to me, "I am Yeshua HaNazrati, whom you are persecuting." Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. It's pretty consistent with this previous description. It's obvious Luke was taking dictation from Paul. But in verse 10, he tells us that Yeshua tells him he will learn in Damascus all that he has been what? Appointed to do. Again, paralleling the idea of a calling of a prophet. Now jump down to 14 and 15. And he said, "The God of our fathers handpicked you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear an utterance from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to all people of what you have seen and heard." It is Ananias that has been appointed to act as a prophet to Shaul. Even though Ananias himself is skeptical, as we said before, he still does this. Ananias acts sort of like a prophet talking to Shaul. The God of our fathers handpicked you to know his will. That's what it says. Paul is to be a witness of all that he personally has seen and heard. This is the underlying motivation of all of Paul's writings. And what did Ananias then tell him? Get up, go be immersed, wash away your sins, calling on his name. So this is immersion in the name of Yeshua. It was given by divine authority. It will be the foundation of all that Paul does. It is for this reason that he points out so often, especially when he is dealing with mere men who bring into the assemblies that Paul has planted. These men bring in untruths and divisive theologies which divide and threaten God's elect, both from the circumcision and from the uncircumcision. Paul will bring God's good news to the Gentiles, and he will defend those Gentiles against lies that threaten their new covenantal relationship with God. This Paul's zeal all comes from this moment of this encounter. This is not all of Paul's commissioning. After his preliminary journeys, when Paul found himself next in the temple at Jerusalem, he had another encounter. Now, once again, this would have been a good time if we were talking about that popular theology, the one that says that Paul was converted. This encounter would have been a good time for Yeshua to say, Paul, what are you doing here in the temple? We've dumped this Judaism stuff. Get out of the temple and go write a systematic theology of Christianity. But he didn't. That's not what happened. Keeping in mind the setting, Paul is defending himself from false allegations that he was anti-Torah and had violated the halakhic ruling about where Gentiles could and could not go in the temple precincts. Listen to the account in Acts chapter 22, right here, verse 17 through 21. It happened that when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, hurry, get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your witness about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I was imprisoning and beating those trusting in you. Even when the blood of your witness Stephen was spilled, I too was standing by, approving and guarding the clothing of those who were killing him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And again, as to Paul's calling, he is clear that he has been sent to the Gentiles by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Messiah of Israel. Some important things to note. First, Yeshua meets him in the temple precincts. Apparently, Yeshua had not given up on the Temple Mount. Some important second thing to note is he's been warned that the Asian, we often say Asian, but Asian, if you will, Jews, that is diaspora Jews coming from Asia, and the leadership to which they tattled that were present in Jerusalem, they would not listen. And please understand that this is a specific group of Jews, some from the diaspora and the leadership. This is not the entirety of Jews on earth. And he clearly tells them exactly what was said to him in the temple by Yeshua. I will send you away to the Gentiles. Verse 22 tells us, up to this statement, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices, saying, away from the earth with this fellow, for he is not fit to live. The reaction of these Asian Jews and the leadership is really not very accepting of that idea, is it? It says, up to this point they listened, but here they could not accept the rest of what he was saying. That the Jewish Messiah would care about the Gentiles? This was not in this narrow group of people, this small group of people, in their theology, this was not acceptable. This reflects part of the larger diverse attitudes among the various sects of Jews at the time. We'll look on that deeper in the coming days, but for now, let's just fill out this view of Paul's calling. Clearly, Paul has been told by Yeshua that the time has come for Gentiles to hear that God also desires to fulfill the promise given to Abraham. That's what we just read in Jeremiah 4:2, prophet to the nations. So the encounters with Yeshua appear to be taken by Paul as something like a prophetic calling. It is often looked on as a conversion, but that's not it. In fact, that Abrahamic promise, you want to see another parallel, what we just read? And he said to me, go, for I will send you away to the Gentiles. What was the calling of Abraham? Lech lecha. Go yourself to another land. Go far away. There's even a parallel to Abraham in Paul's calling to stand up and spread the good news to the Gentiles. Paul's behavior and teaching speak that he is working from within Judaism, not condemning from the outside. There certainly was a conversion on the road to Damascus and in the temple, but it was a conversion of attitude, not abandonment of Judaism. Paul converted to a new way of thinking about the Jewish followers of Yeshua and their interaction with Gentiles. He taught of unity through heart circumcision, yet clearly recognized Gentile identity as the uncircumcision. His point being that when Jews are circumcised and Gentiles remain uncircumcised, they are both being obedient to God. It is therefore interesting that an Ivy League Torah scholar whose Jewishness and Jewish practice of Torah is impeccable would be called to bring the good news of the Torah to the nations. But Rav Shaul was also a diaspora Jew who held Roman citizenship. And because he was a student of Gamliel, this is a point I may not have made before. Among the teachers of Israel, most of them shied away from Jews learning foreign languages. But Gamliel and the house of Hillel later was not so. They encouraged the learning of Greek so they could understand Greek and understand the people that were around them. So Paul, being a student of that, was encouraged to study and understand Greek. Even some of those, like the house of Shammai, had recommended a fast day for the day when the Torah was translated into Greek. But my point being that because of Shaul's unique position, Yeshua looked on him as, what did he call him? A choice instrument, the right tool for the job. The right tool in the Redeemer's hands. He was the one who would undertake long journeys through the lands of the Gentiles, sharing his message both with diaspora Jews, of which he was one himself, but also the Gentiles with whom he was very familiar. And he would testify before kings, just as predicted. Paul clearly met all the aspects of his prophetic calling, and he was the one who could do it because he understood the Torah in its depths, what we were talking about today, the underlying precepts, the Torah morals, the Torah ethics. This is what he brings in his letters to the Gentile people. Along the way, though, well, let me finish this thought out. Far from converting to another religion that he was in the process of inventing, Paul was adapting his understanding of Judaism to the ring of the eschatological alarm clock. That is the end times alarm clock that he had heard. It was time for Jews and Gentiles to be reconciled in the atoning work of the crucified, risen, and ascendant Jewish Messiah. It was time for the twofold promise of Abraham, both to the Jews and to all the families of the world, to begin to be fulfilled as it is being fulfilled to this very day and in this very place. Along the way, however, Paul's message and the assemblies which he planted encountered difficulties, just as ours do today. It is one thing to receive the good news when it is proclaimed. It is yet a second task to live long term in the good news, living it out in community, loving one another as we are supposed to. Yeshua is the shepherd of God's precious flock, and none can assail him. Under-shepherds were then selected, and they have a little different task. Paul was among the first of the under-shepherds, and he had much difficulty to deal with that he fully understood was part and parcel of his calling, all the difficulties recorded in these letters. Ezekiel in chapter 34 had warned of the failure of the leadership of the Jewish people. He called them shepherds. And that changed when Yeshua came and was the good shepherd who took over. But when he ascended, he left his apostles in his place. Peter had a breakfast, if you will recall, of bread and fish by the seashore with the risen Yeshua in Galilee. It's recorded in John chapter 21, verses 15 through 17. When they had finished breakfast, Yeshua said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, Shimon bar Yonah, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he repeats this 3 times. This threefold commissioning of Peter as apostle to the circumcision. Feed my lambs. Before his crucifixion, speaking as the Good Shepherd, Yeshua said to John in John chapter 10, verse 16, "I have other sheep that are not from this fold. Those also I must lead, and they will listen to my voice. So there shall be one flock, one shepherd." The commissioning of Peter as was the identification of the under-shepherd for the flock of the circumcision. The road to Damascus encounter commissioned Paul as the under-shepherd for the other sheep, the flock of the uncircumcision. Now, Peter and Paul would need to be aware of something else Yeshua said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15 through 17. "Watch out for false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruit. Grapes aren't gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? Even so, every good tree produces good fruit, but the rotten tree produces bad fruit. This, as we shall see, was the problem that Paul would repeatedly have to address. Ravenous wolves in sheep's clothing, that is, people pretending to be among the flock, would come in with a different agenda. And they would try to steer the sheep away from Yeshua. And they would produce bad fruit along the way, the fruit of deception, the fruit of division. Paul's response to these wolves are found among his epistles. Galatians is a clear example of that. Next week, we will look at the problem that is central to Galatians. The problem Paul had to deal with as the under-shepherd. It's identified as false brothers having brought something in. That's wolves in sheep's clothing. The relationships of Jews and Gentiles in those early assemblies in Galatia were at risk of this, the peaceful coexistence. We'll explore the likely influences on the false brothers and how those influences were positioned in Judaism as a whole. And we will see how Paul dealt with it. And wow, that rabbi of yours sure talks a lot. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Blessed Lord our God, our Father in heaven, we are so grateful that you did, in fact, bring this moment to fruition. The calling of the emissaries to the Jews and the Gentiles. We're grateful that you have created a space for us to worship in together, one in Messiah. Lord, I pray that these words that we are reading, that these letters that we are reading, that you will make them relevant to us. Help us, Lord, to walk in the ways that you desire us to walk. I pray a blessing on this beautiful house, on these wonderful souls you have gathered together. And I pray this all, B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.